Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Myra Brown, and I am the Vice Chair of Women's Way. We are here today to have a conversation about anti-racism and white supremacy. In America today, we talk about anti-racism, but are we consciously racist? That is the question. And Diane and I are going to explore some of the work that we've done around this issue. We're going to talk about our journey to overcome racism, how to rewire our brains, so to speak, and bring about some sort of racial healing. Statements aren't enough. We need daily acts of anti-racism. Through diverse leadership, inclusive practices, and creating a culture of acceptance and personal responsibility of being anti-racist. So we appreciate you being here for our journey and our discussion. We welcome all of our wonderful leaders that are on the Zoom here with us and will be calling in with their questions. And let's get started on this journey together. It's my pleasure to introduce Diane Cornman-Levy, who is the Executive Director of Women's Way of Philadelphia.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to have this really important conversation.
Yes. What brought us here today, Diane? Can you talk about our journey? How did we meet and
Oh my
why are we
goodness.
here?
Yeah, so we met, I don't know how many years ago, several years ago, actually at an event that was honoring Black women leaders.
That's right.
And Women's Way was actually the nonprofit that they were going to donate to. And so when I came to this, it was at Joan Shep's place. And
Which
they
we
do
love
this,
her.
yes, where she's amazing.
Yes.
And she does this event every year. And I heard these amazing Black women leaders talk, and Myra really resonated with me. And I went up and we started having a conversation. And I said, I want to get to know you more. And then we met, we started talking, and I said, I would love you to be on our board. I think your voice, your experiences, your perspectives, your leadership would really add value to the work that we do at Women's Way, because Women's Way is about gender and racial equity and justice. And then you said yes, you joined the board. And how many years ago was that?
Oh my God, maybe 5 or 6 years ago?
5 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah, and we have had some very interesting conversations since you joined the board.
Absolutely.
Some of the challenges we have faced as an organization around racism, internalized racism, and I think, having women and men like you on our board to challenge us is really critical to moving our organization to becoming an anti-racist organization. So. This is not just our first conversation. We've had many conversations around
we
this
talk all
issue.
the time about these things. And it's so great that we can comfortably have this conversation.
Yeah,
so it's kind of like everyone's looking in on us having our normal conversation today. So this is great. All right, well, let's get started. So, we're talking about advancing racial equity. We must challenge and dismantle white supremacy, obviously. How do you and Women's Way define white supremacy?
Which is a great question, because what I've learned over the years is first we had to have language around these concepts, right? So we hear a lot of things about anti-racism, racism, white supremacy. If you really can't explain it, then how do you even talk about it? So for us, it's really this pseudo-scientific concept of race to create whiteness and a racialized hierarchy of human value, where white people are at the top of this hierarchy of human value, particularly white heterosexual Christian men, and women, particularly women of color, are at the bottom of the hierarchy. So it's a way to justify oppression and exploitation of white people towards people of color, so that white people, and historically it's been white Christian men, to put them at an unfair advantage politically, socially, economically. So if you look at the economic pyramid in the United States, the top 1% are predominantly white men, and that's intentional. It was created that way out of a system of white supremacy. And it's so interesting how white supremacy is continued and upheld. It's psychological conditioning, like you said. It's this psychic conditioning and toxic belonging that continues to tell us, white, black, and brown people, that whiteness has value, whiteness is value. Blackness has less value, for some people no value, and worse, it's dangerous, right? And so,
Very.
and then it justifies the exploitation and oppression of people of color, so that white people can be at an advantage, and it's an unearned advantage, right? That we have access to more resources and opportunities.
Yeah.
And so one of the strategies I think white supremacy does to do this, it separates us, it segregates us, it divides white people from Black, Indigenous people of color, it separates Black, Indigenous people of color from each other, it separates us from our planet, and it even separates us from ourselves, so it teaches us not to trust ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's this psychological conditioning that just becomes part of our mental models, like you said. And so in order to dismantle white supremacy, we have to rewire our brains.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a hard thing to do.
It's a really
I
hard
mean,
thing to
you and I literally had a situation today because you just naturally think, I need to do it this way.
Right.
Because you have that advantage, you have that privilege, and this is what you're used to doing. And it's different. How did it feel when I stopped you and said, hold on, when I stop you and I challenge you, how does that feel for you?
Yeah, so to prepare for this conversation today, we're just gonna put it out there, Myra gave me questions a while ago, and I said, great, they look great. And then I thought, I know, I'm gonna add some new ones, I'm gonna change the ordering, and then I sent out this morning, like, here's the revised questions, you know, without like having a conversation with you. And Myra said, you know, I'll do this, but this is an act of white supremacy. And what it does to me now is it puts me in a state of, first of all, instead of intellectualizing ourselves out of that feedback, you got to sit with it emotionally. So I felt embarrassed. I had like this sick feeling in my stomach, and you sit there with it and reflect on it, like, wow, why did I do that? You know, it was that white supremacy, a lot of behaviors, you know, I want to take control, right?
Yeah.
It's my final decision.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
And why did I resort to that? And what I'm learning through self-reflection and self-awareness, which is critical to rewiring your brain, is when I get anxious, and I suffer from anxiety at times, I tend to resort to white supremacy practices. I want to control things. I want to make things happen fast. Like, okay, there's this sense of urgency, and that's part of white supremacy culture. If we always feel there's something urgent, then we don't value relationships. We don't value taking time to listen to everyone's voices, and so I resort to that. And so what I have to do is start recognizing those moments. How do I self-regulate that? How do I challenge that type of internalized white supremacy in response to being anxious? So I thank you for that, because I didn't even recognize I was doing that, right?
Yes.
And that's the relationship we have. It's like, and this is why it's so important to have relationships across race, you know, and have these open conversations.
Right, and to think about how the other person feels. You know, these were my questions.
Right.
And, you know, for you to change them, I felt, wow, that, you know, that's the ultimate act of white supremacy.
Right.
But the fact that we have the relationship that we do, where we could be open and I can say, and I can call you on it, and you can reflect and say, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
That's really, really important.
Yeah.
And getting to that point is really, it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, and so anti-racist work is a journey.
It is.
And you have to make it a priority. You have to put time and energy into it. And it's all about quality of relationships. It's all about listening and spending time with, you know, Black and brown people, that and really and being vulnerable, being willing to be vulnerable and not get defensive. Because that was my reaction a lot of times as a white woman. Wait a minute, I'm not racist. You know, I don't say the N-word. I'm not nasty. I'm like, wow.
And it's deeper than that.
It's so deep.
Yeah, it really is.
So deep.
Great, great. So Women's Way's mission is to advance gender equity.
Yeah.
But we're talking a lot about racial equity.
Yeah.
How is racial equity central to the mission of advancing gender equity?
It's a great question, and I think, you know, if you look at the history of the women's movement, when white women were trying to get the right to vote, and also Black women were trying to get the right to vote, because, you know, Black folks didn't have the right to vote, white women basically said, well, it's more important to get the women's right to vote than Black people, and it was like kind of pushed them away. And so there's this rift between Black and white women, and there's reason for it. And so, you know, sexism, racism are all byproducts of white supremacy.
Yes.
And those at the bottom of the economic pyramid are women of color because of the intersection of race and gender, right? Because what white supremacy tells us is white men are more valuable than white women are more valuable than black women, black heterosexual women are more valuable than black gay, trans women, whatever, you know,
Exactly.
right? So if we want to create an environment that embraces everyone, that everyone has full participation and can bring their authentic selves to the table, to any place, then we have to center anti-racism, because anti-blackness is a way to keep white supremacy alive and well. And so in order to make sure that all women thrive, we have to address white supremacy and anti-blackness, right? And so that's why now at Women's Way, our theory of change now is, for gender equity, is white supremacy is the root cause of all gender inequities, and until we dismantle white supremacy, we will never get there.
That's great. And you know, when we talk about this in our meetings, it makes me feel proud to be part of Women's Way at this juncture. You know, one of the things I've talked to you about is years ago, I've had friends who were on the board who've, you know, talked to me about coming on board, and I was scared to death because I didn't like what the board looked like, because no one looked like me. So there's never been a better time to be part of this, and now to be the vice chair and in this kind of leadership role is really ultimate for a black woman. You know, this is really important work that we're doing, and it's timely for me to be in this role. So this is great. This is great. So let's talk about how you intend to promote this idea of, you know, racial equity with the board members, with the staff members, and in your own personal life.
Right.
What is your plan?
So let me start with my personal life. You know, I thought I was not racist, right? And I'd done a lot of nonprofit work, and I started a nonprofit in North Philly. And then I started these programs without ever asking what the community wanted. I went in as this white savior, again, thinking that, oh, we should strive to be like white people, right? That's what's more valuable. That's the norm. And I was doing unbelievable harm. And when I reflect on it, I came from that framework of white people coming in and saving black and brown people, coming in from, let's focus on their individual behavior instead of the systemic injustices that they are experiencing. So, so personally, I said, I have to shift my whole racial identity, right? I have to really understand it from a position of white privilege and white supremacy. So I dug deep into doing all kinds of readings and dug deep on the history of this country. Because frankly, we don't know the real history of this country. White people really don't. And how it's taught in school is bogus.
Correct.
It's part of white supremacy. So when I started really learning, and I'm ashamed that it took me this long, to learn the real history of this country and why whiteness was created to begin with, I had to really sit and grapple with my own whiteness.
Wow.
And white solidarity, right? So part of it is this learning about the history, learning why whiteness was created to begin with, and then how did I internalize white supremacy? How have I done it as a mother, as a wife, as an executive director, as a member of my circles, you know, who I hang out with?
Exactly.
So I started exploring that and then started challenging it, and now I talk about it with people in my community. I talk about it with my daughters. My grandsons are, he's 3, it's a little young, but.
He'll get there.
And then I started looking at, where do I shop? Do I support predominantly white-owned stores and companies? So I started exploring that. So now I'm like, no, I want to support local, more people of color-owned businesses.
Thank you.
Where do I hang out? Where do I put my money? Right. So am I putting money in things that are going to really promote racial equity as an individual? On a professional level, again, I brought this whole perspective in, and I said, you know, we really had to look at our theory of change, and now we're doing this deep dive into our theory of change about centering white supremacy. And we had to educate our board, right? Because when I first came to Women's Way, I started talking about we have to deal with racism. And the board was like, what does that have to do with gender equity? So there's a lot of education.
Yes, there is.
A lot of education with the board, with the staff, with donors, which is a very tricky conversation.
Very much so.
And we've lost some donors because I started having that conversation. But that's what we have to do. We have to have these conversations. And we also do a lot of things like we have the Closing the Gender Wealth Gap series. And what we're doing is we're talking about the drivers of the gender wealth gap. And every driver, whether it's reproductive justice, housing inequities, health inequities, economic inequities, we are trying to connect the dots of white supremacy to those drivers of the gender wealth gap. So that started over a year ago, and now we're extending it to having community conversations, because we really do need to have these conversations on an ongoing level. Yeah, so those are some of the things that we're starting to do, and there's more.
And the timing is right for those conversations.
Yeah.
And even internally, I'm looking at how we're working within the board, within HR and development and policy, and looking at really diving deeper into every single area of Women's Way and everything that we're doing. So this is really important.
Yeah, it's really important.
Good. Let's talk about how you will use your white privilege, your platform, to champion racial equity in the organization and outside of the organization.
Right. So some of the things I said. So, so personally, I've ended dinner conversations. I've lost some friends around this. But that's where, if you truly want to live an anti-racist life, and we can talk more about that, you have to break away from white solidarity. So you're going to lose some friends, right? And even some board members left. So again, it's talking about it. It's challenging people not in a judgy way, but helping them kind of explore their own internalized racism. I'm talking about on a personal level and within our staff and board, and then doing concrete action steps. So some of the things we're doing, we're creating this whole theory of change where white supremacy is the root cause, and how do we embed anti-racism into every aspect of our organization? So we're looking at our hiring practices, our board recruitment selection process. We're looking at our grant making, our language that we use,
our nominating, development, all of those things.
All those things. Yeah. And I'll give you a concrete example. So we have a small endowment. It's like a little over $3 million. And so we get 4% of our return is about $110,000. And we usually just put it in the general operating fund. Well, first of all, the folks that were managing our endowment was owned by white men. Because the financial world, as we know, is very controlled.
Mostly white.
Yeah, it's mostly white
men. Yeah.
And so I said no. So we purposely found a company that was founded and owned by a black man and a black woman, Zenith Wealth Partners. They're awesome, by the way, folks.
Yes, they are.
And they are now managing our portfolio. That's one thing we're doing. So we're looking at all our vendors, like who do we hire as consultants, right? Yes. And then on top of that, we said, well, we get this money, right? $110,000. It just goes into our sustainability of our organization. What if we reinvest that to support women of color entrepreneurs? So we're working with Zenith Wealth Partners and Tanya Moores, who's head of Mom Your Business.
She's great.
She's fantastic. And we're creating an investment fund to support women of color entrepreneurs, but we want to put skin in the game. So we are going to put almost all of our return back into women of color entrepreneurs, and then we're going to have a challenge of other foundations to do this.
Yeah, and that's so important in this community.
So we have to put our money where our mouth is. It's one thing to talk about it, but how do we, it's reparations. How do we start changing? And I believe in that. A lot I have to learn, but how do we start redistributing resources, right? Yes. And the other thing we're looking at is our grant making. So we are prioritizing women of color-led nonprofits, but I would like to really move towards a much more participatory grant making, where those most impacted by injustices are telling us where resources need to go and how it should be distributed. Decision-making power is...
Skin in the game, yeah. I mean, like you, I was in social services for many years as an ED, and all around me were white people making decisions about people that looked like me that were receiving the services, and it's really very, lopsided, the whole system.
Right.
So you making a move like that and recognizing the need to rethink how you do this and what you're doing, that was really important.
Yeah, and I just want to say, philanthropy, and I know we have someone here from a foundation, is part of the problem. and my board's probably going, but they're a byproduct of white supremacy, right? I mean, a lot of foundations are created because wealthy people get a tax write-off, right? Yeah. And yet, then they dictate where this money should go. And then we're accountable to funders rather than to those impacted by injustices. That makes no sense. So we're trying to model that, you know, we need to be accountable to those most impacted by injustices, and for us, it's Black and brown women, right? And not just to funders who are giving us money, and let those impacted by systemic injustices and racism inform us how to spend the money, where to distribute these funds. It's turning philanthropy totally upside down.
Upside down, and I love it.
Yeah.
And it's necessary. And I talked about that in my interview on the Women's Way site.
Right.
That we're going to see a change in philanthropy, and this is really important.
And even another more radical thing to do, and it's not radical in my mind because it's about justice and equity, is something called participatory budgeting. So we create our budgets, and this is to me a form of racism. It's been primarily done by me, the chair, and our controller, all white women. And we do have a finance committee, but it's predominantly white. And we decide where we're going to put our money, where we're going to spend it. Well, participatory budgeting, you get people, those impacted by injustices, and actually say, where are you putting your money? How are you spending your money? Right. And that's a very...
This is what's needed.
This is what's needed. Yeah. And I want to relate one more thing to that. Historically, we've asked so many people who have been impacted by poverty and oppression, exploitation, to come and do focus groups and share their stories and serve on panels without ever compensating them. So we are developing a policy that anytime we have a woman with lived experience do any work for us, we pay them. Because they are subject matter experts, that's their intellectual property, and they need to be compensated.
That's groundbreaking. Thank you. And I hope people who hear this conversation are listening to these ideas and hopefully moving them forward in their own organizations. That's great.
I hope so too. We're learning. We're not experts. We're just, we're on this journey together.
But I think this journey has made you even begin to think more outside of the box. Yes. You're thinking outside of yourself and what your normal practices have been for most of your career. Yep. And that's a major shift. And like you said, it's not always going to be popular. It's never going to be comfortable. But we're getting there, and we're making a positive impact on the people who need it most. So that's so important right now.
Yeah, and I think, part of white privilege for me in the past was I chose comfort over really challenging rocking the boat, right? And I see it all the time with white people. It's like, I don't want to talk about Diane, but I'm not racist because I don't, I'm nice to Black and brown people, and that's a whole nother discussion, what it means to be anti-racist. And like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to be uncomfortable. It's like that whole discussion about bringing racist theory and all this into schools. And I hear white mothers going, but that's going to make my children uncomfortable.
Yes.
Well, what do you think Black and brown children are facing every day?
We've been uncomfortable our whole lives.
Yes. So part of it is building up resilience and practicing being vulnerable.
Yes.
And I think vulnerability is a really important trait of being an effective leader.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even just thinking about being vulnerable in a situation like what we went through with the questions, a lot of Black and brown people wouldn't speak up because they would feel that, okay, I'm going to be seen a certain way, or, I'm going to be seen as aggressive or something like that. So I better just keep my mouth shut. But because we have a relationship, I can say, Diane, that's white supremacy right there. I'm leaving these questions just like they are. But most people wouldn't feel comfortable in that situation.
No, and I think I saw that in our board. We had some Black and brown members, and they weren't as engaged as white. And I think one of my previous practice of white supremacy was, well, maybe they just don't care about the organization, or they're too busy. But I never took time to talk to them one-on-one on what was their experience of being on this board.
Yes.
Did you feel included? Do you feel respected? Do you feel valued? Do you feel trusted? And probably they would have all said no.
Exactly. I was part of those side conversations, but I was the only
Yes.
one willing to speak up and bring them to your attention.
Yes, and I thank you, Myra, because you were saying you were getting less engaged with Women's Way because of the culture.
Yeah.
And then we had that conversation and you put it out on the table like, Diane,
Yes.
you're not addressing this.
Yes.
You know, you need to step up. You need to be more of a, what we call an upstander, not a bystander. Like, you know, and you need to work with the board about this, frankly, this culture that's grounded in white supremacy, which it was, right?
It really was.
I mean, you shared that experience with me when you had to be interviewed by...
Oh, by the board, yeah. And so the chair and the vice chair invited me for coffee, and thankfully I live right at the main line, so I knew this place that they invited me to, and I thought, if you had somebody else from Philadelphia that was not me and didn't live where I live or interact or run in the circles that I do, they wouldn't feel comfortable coming here. Why didn't they pick a place or ask for a suggestion that would have been mutually agreeable and comfortable for all parties involved? They just went where they felt comfortable.
Yeah, and that's another act of white supremacy. You're going to come to my neighborhood. You're going to come to where I work because it's easier for me. I'm more comfortable in this space.
Right, right.
And that happened a lot.
Yeah. And fortunately, I lived right there, so it was okay for me, but I noted it in my brain that this is abnormal, and do I really want to be part of this?
Yeah, yeah.
And it made me say, yes, I do need to be part. Not do I want to, but I need to be part of this.
Yes, and thank you.
That was important.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Prior to the racial equity training, what efforts were made by you to understand minorities and their experience in the workplace and in the boardroom?
Not enough.
Yeah.
And I think I was alluding to that before, that, you know, we do this annual board survey, right? Like, how do you feel about being on the board? Do you feel engaged? And that was really it, you know? And I think spending time developing real relationships with board members, and that requires meeting one-on-one, having conversations like we have had. And I didn't do that enough, you know? And asking, and also I think we need to create systems for really giving everyone a safe place to give feedback.
Yes.
And I'm challenged with that right now.
And we talk about that all the time. Yes, because sometimes people don't feel as comfortable.
No.
Yes.
So I'm asking my staff now, because there's a power dynamic. I can hire and fire a staff person. There's also a power dynamic between executive directors and boards, because they hire and fire me.
Right.
So there's all these power dynamics. So how do we create systems where staff feel safe to call me out? So I'm asking them. All the staff, but that's part of the process, right?
Yeah. It's part of empowering too.
Yeah.
You know, but you're the type of leader who solicits feedback, whether positive or negative, and you act on things. It's, you know, developing yourself as a leader. You know, it's the people and what they're looking at in their leader. So that's a whole other journey, a whole other conversation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us are afraid to ask for feedback, for fear of what we're going to hear, but that's what helps us grow.
Grow, right.
And then that's what helps us develop relationships of trust, you know. And once you have that, your organization just goes to the next level.
Exactly. Yeah, that's good stuff. Over the past year, we went through the racial equity intervention. We tried to advance our efforts to become more of an anti-racist organization. Talk about the process, because it's been long. It's been arduous. Not every board member was engaged the whole time. Why did you select this particular process, and what did you learn during the process?
Oh my gosh. There's so many people doing this work now. And I have to say, I have some skepticism around that, because I think it's like, it's hot topic right now. DEI work.
DEI.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, which is different than what we did. But we can talk about that in a minute.
So I love these two consultants. It's I'm just going to say their names: Deidre Ashman and Sarah Haley. One black woman, one white woman.
Yes.
And when I met them, they said, you know, we're going to do a deep dive into the inner work. And the inner work is, people tend to go right to, like, let's create new policies, let's get a DEI officer, let's get a DEI committee. But we don't address our internalized racism.
Exactly.
The rewiring that you initially talked about. So you can have policies in place, you can have practices in place that you think are anti-racist, but if you still have internalized white superiority, you're going to continue to do behaviors, do actions like I did this morning without even realizing it. So they do the inner work first, and basically they help us recognize it's not just white people. We all internalize this, right? This
Yeah.
white supremacy. And how is it playing out in our brains? How is it playing out in our actions and behaviors? And then we learn to kind of challenge it and self-regulate it and interrupt that. Because until we do this, the inner work, the interpersonal and the organizational work is not going to go well. So we have to start with the inner work and then the interpersonal work. So how we relate to each other, and then the organizational work, and then the community work.
Right.
So I don't know a lot of consultants that do that deep dive into the inner work.
Yeah. It was amazing what they did.
Yeah.
And it even made us, some of the people of color on the board, have conversations about ourselves. And I actually revealed that to you because I said, we're racist too, and how we accept white supremacy and respond to it. Because like your action this morning, normally it would just be kind of like, roll my eyes, that's white people.
Right.
That's what they do.
Right.
Because you are not in a position of comfort where you can say, Diane, that was white supremacy. I'm keeping those questions exactly like. Most people of color are not in that position in their relationships with white people because it's their boss or someone that's in a superior role to them. So they're not going to call that out, but they're going to be racist in a way in their acceptance of the white supremacy by responding with, it's white people, we're going to just chuck that up. But
so I'm going to go back to trust. We have to build relationships on trust, and that's one of the things we should measure, actually.
Yes.
And how do we measure that? And it's not just a survey. It has to be these deep conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that takes time, but it's so critical to our work. I mean, if we can't even be an anti-racist organization, how dare us to say other people have to be an anti-racist organization? Or, it's so hypocritical.
Absolutely.
And I will encourage all organizations, foundations, to do this work.
Please do this work.
Because not only is it hypocritical to say, we want other people to address racism, but if we don't do it within ourselves, then we're just perpetuating it. So it's been, this year-long process. I learned a lot. I still learn that I'm racist. I'm still learning how to peel the layers of white supremacy within my own mental models. And I'm learning more about acts of racism in our own organization that are not intentional, but, and so the more you do this work, the more you realize, wow, the more work you have to do.
Yes. So as a result of all of this that we've done, learning and, kind of peeling off the layers, do you call out racism when you see it?
I do now.
Wow. You feel comfortable to do that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. And what about relationships? Because that's a tricky...
I said I've lost... I was talking to an individual donor, and again, she just said something, and I was like, that's grounded in white supremacy, what you just said. And it was an interesting conversation. I haven't heard back from this person. I am bringing it up in a way that, again, I'm not above someone. I'm like, hey, I'm so great about this. Like, I'm just like trying to help people recognize it and know that, hey, I get where it's coming from. We've been conditioned to think this way from day one, from when you're in utero.
Yes.
I mean, it's just this psychological and toxic belonging, by the way. It's toxic. It's toxic to us. And I'm going to say this as a white person. When you start freeing yourself from white supremacy, when you start dismantling it, you become more free yourself. And I would say a lot of white women compromise themselves because they're married to white men. They're like, I know there's some sexism going on here. There's a power dynamic I don't like, but I got to uphold white supremacy because I'm benefiting from it economically.
That's right.
So I think white women are in the key position to disrupt white supremacy.
So what do you recommend to we have all these wonderful leaders here from other organizations who are white. And what do you recommend to these executive directors who happen to be white in their quest to advance racial equity and anti-racism in their own organizations?
And I know a lot of them are all on this journey, but I think it's really starting with this inner work and being really willing to look at ourselves and examine ourselves. I mean, anti-racist work requires ongoing self-examination, self-reflection, And white supremacy tells us not to examine ourselves as white people, right? We just accept that. We're the norm, right? But to do that, and if you can't do it, and invest in it. Put money and time and hire consultants to help do this work, with you and your board. And again, put money where your mouth is. If you're really serious about this, I remember the board going, well, we don't have money for this. And remember that?
Remember that.
And I said, we're going to do it
We're gonna
regardless we have
fund it.
money,
Yes,
but I'm going to get a grant. And we
That's
did.
right.
We got
Yes,
a grant.
you did. Thank
and
you.
Right, because
Yeah.
you have to put time and money, resources into this work
Yeah.
to take it seriously.
So important.
Yeah,
So important.
absolutely.
It often takes white people many, many years before they recognize or accept racism. How do you process and accept your own development of racial identity?
One that it's going to be forever. It's an ongoing process. I'm 61 years old, and I did a lot of work around trying to deal with inequities, but I did it from a very white savior perspective. So I had to unlearn a lot of stuff.
Yes.
And really go deep and put myself in, like, this is not a comfortable situation, but put myself in an uncomfortable situation and really continue to challenge myself and challenge my identity. And again, keep, self-reflection and self-awareness is a practice. You just don't do it. You got to practice it every day.
Over time.
And again, when I start feeling anxious and there's timelines, I'm like, I don't have time for this. I don't have time to reflect on this. I know, this idea of do.
Yeah.
This idea of I'm so busy is a form of white supremacy. Because to slow down, to self-reflect means you got to slow down a little bit.
Absolutely.
So I have to practice that. So like I said, I'm not an expert in this. I'm learning. I'm continuing to make mistakes, but I'm committed to it, and the benefits outweigh the cost of losing some friends. I've gained so many incredible new friends like you, Myra. I have learned so much more about me. I have, there's a sense of freedom when you start letting go of white supremacy as a white woman.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered the question well.
No, you did, and it feels good. You're self-aware right now.
Right.
You're being very self-aware of, this is where I am. This is what my mindset is.
Right.
And it's a journey, and you have to take a step back. And even as a black woman, I have to look at myself before I interact with white people on a consistent basis.
Right.
And, okay, how am I going to respond to this? How am I going to deal with this, et cetera? Helping them to be anti-racist and, promoting myself as I'm competent. I belong here. I can do this. I can help you. So it's oh my God, the conversation is ongoing.
Yeah, and I acted a certain way with one of my staff. I haven't talked to her yet, and it was kind of like, it was like blaming her on something and judging her, and I'm going to go apologize for her because it was not right. And again, I was feeling anxious. I'd get something done. We're not getting what we need to get done, and it's like, so I need to. And that required reflection. Why did I act that way?
You're
Why did I do
self-reflecting.
that? Oh my God, what harm did I cause on her at that moment? And empathy is critical.
Yeah. And sometimes that's different than even being anti-racist or,
Right.
It's just we're thinking at a higher level, and you expect everyone to think along with you and move at the same pace.
True.
And they're not.
Right.
I go through this all day.
Right, because you own two businesses?
2 companies,
Yeah, 2 companies.
So I do this all day, and it's like
Right.
my brain is working so fast. Why aren't you there with me?
Right.
And then I have to take a step back and look at myself. Well, how did that person receive that information? I can tell from their face that was
Yep.
not good. How I said it versus what I was saying, and it's not intentional. Just like being racist isn't.
Right.
Being
Right.
racist normally is not intentional. The little things.
Right.
When we know this, but it's just taking a step back and being aware that you did it. And how do I do this differently in the future?
And I do want to say it's messy work.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And it's okay to make mistakes because I think I see a lot of, even my staff says, I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing if I'm talking about it. I'm like, it's better to say than to be silent. Because we had to build the muscles of talking about this.
Yeah.
I remember who told me that white people are at the kindergarten level when they talk about racism and anti-racism, and black and brown people are at the PhD level. I'm like, because we never talked about it, right? We didn't have to talk about it.
Yes.
And now it's like, and I'm encouraging my staff, it's okay.
Yeah.
We'll make mistakes. It's okay. And again, that goes into that whole perfectionism thing of white supremacy culture. And but the learning is just profound if you really open your mind to it.
Because, as a Black or brown person, you're living racism constantly.
Yeah.
Just the little infractions and things that happen, it's constant. So we talk about it very comfortably. When it's happening or you get called on it as a white person, then it's like, oh, I need to discuss this.
Yeah.
But you don't see it on a normal basis because you're not living it. Your privilege is different.
That's a privilege.
Well, you have privilege.
We have privilege, right.
Yeah, that's by the color of your skin, you have privilege.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I bring up race sometimes, white people go, well, that's racist talking about race.
No, it's not.
No,
it's
actually
healthy.
not talking about race
Right.
is racism. And,
Exactly.
and also you're either racist or anti-racist.
Yes.
And that's a whole nother concept for us to understand as white people, because they're like, wait a minute, I have Black friends, I'm nice to Black people,
Oh my
I have Black
goodness.
people. But
That's the worst response.
anti-racist is taking actions to address a systemic racism. And that's a whole nother level. And that's what I learned over the years, that I wasn't being anti-racist, and when I thought I was.
Yeah.
And so now I'm just taking all that in, and how do I apply it personally, professionally,
Yeah. It's so funny because we talk about this, Black people talk about this all the time. When white people say, oh, but I have Black friends, it's kind of like you've compartmentalized this and you can count. I have 4 Black friends. Like, why are you, that makes you so racist just saying that.
Yeah.
I've compartmentalized and I can tell you I have 4
Right,
Black
right.
friends. Why do you have that information? Why do you, you're being racist right now.
Right.
So yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that.
We don't like it, and it is insulting, and it is racist in our eyes. So yes, just you have friends, and
Right.
they are from different ethnicities, and that's it.
Yeah,
And appreciate them
absolutely.
for what they bring to the friendship.
Right, I was just at Longwood Garden, and I thought, what makes this beautiful? The different colors.
Yeah.
When you think about cuisine, what makes cuisine so great? Different ethnicities coming together and
Yes.
fusing food, like you're a cook. Well, what happens when you have diverse people from diverse experiences, cultures, ethnicities, race, the creativity and innovation just goes like this.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And the learning goes like this. So
Right.
there's so many benefits to it. In fact, research shows when kids go to school in more integrated, diverse schools, they're actually more creative, innovative, and they actually perform better. So it's all these lies about segregation is better for people, right? And then the other thing is the zero-sum game. And this is part of the narrative. Well, if you give more to Black and brown people, there's going to be less for white people. Like there's a zero sum. And there's a great book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, that talks about that's a lie, and that's part of the narrative of white supremacy. And you hear that,
Yes, all the time.
like,
Yeah.
oh, well, our taxes are going to support Black and brown people, we're going to get less. And I'm like, that's a lie. That's a lie. And actually,
And you already have more
and you
to
already
begin
have
with.
more. Right, right.
Yeah.
And if all of us are thriving, I just want people to imagine if we're all thriving, what would that look like? What would our world look like?
Yeah,
What would our
the
city look
concept.
like?
Yes.
That we're all not just surviving, but thriving and
Yes.
contributing.
And people of color want to get there.
Yes.
I own an employment company, and we talk about this all the time. It's not your employment plan, your workforce plan, it's your economic plan. Because now you can contribute, you're paying taxes, you can afford to purchase your first home, you can afford
Right.
to invest new concepts for people
Yes.
of color. So
Yeah.
that have not traditionally been what we do.
Right. And the reality is demographics, whites are going to become the minority. So let's celebrate this diversity. Let's celebrate, and we need to do it culturally too, right?
Yes.
And we need
Yes.
to celebrate the music and the food and the fashion and everything, and be able to bring your full authentic self to the table and to work.
That's great. And that's a great way for us to end our conversation and segue into entertaining questions from our Zoom callers. Diane, thank you.
So I had a question. Yes, Diane. I as you peel back the layers of the onion, basically kind of looking at white supremacy in your own life, what were some of the things that maybe caught you by surprise, or that you were like, wow, I never even thought of it from that perspective?
Well, I think, I always thought I was like this great champion for racial equity, but I did it from a perspective of kind of the white savior. And also, I looked at the impact of oppression on individual lives, on Black and brown people, and tend to focus my energy on that rather than the oppression itself. You know what I mean? So I came in from like, oh, let's change individual behavior. Let's focus on the individual, which we still need to help people individually. I'm not undermining that. Instead of adopting an anti-oppressive framework, which is really looking at systems of oppression and how did I uphold some of that myself. So it's really changing my whole framework of even how to address inequities. And we need both. We can't just stop these critical services like you all provide, right? And, people are homeless, people are hungry, but that's the impact of oppression and exploitation. So we have to do that at the same time, address the root causes of oppression and exploitation. So I'm trying to figure that out, actually. That's a great question.
I appreciate that. That's a challenge for us as we, like at the Women's Resource Center, we're doing primarily direct services. And so as we think about what that means to be thinking about the systemic barriers that are impacting all of us, including all of the women we serve, then how does that shift what we're doing even in those direct services? So I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
Food for thought, I guess.
No, it's a great question. Just real quickly, there's an article I'll send to all of you, and it's really helping service providers adopt an anti-oppression framework. So they're still adopting the needs, but it's not like blaming them for like where they are, but it's also giving the people that are coming for help a context of why they are in that situation, and what can they and we do together to really fight systems of oppression and exploitation. It's a great article. I just read it. So I'm learning this still, and I'd love to share it with all of you.
That would be great. Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Building on the comment about anti-oppression, earlier you were talking about how we compensate folks that are sharing their stories, because it's so critical in helping people to understand what the needs are. And I was just wondering, that element of how we don't exploit the folks that we're serving, but really include their voices to the table. Could either of you speak more about that?
Yes, so part of our theory of change is those most impacted by systemic racism, their voices need to be centered. And so one way we do this is that they're on our advisory committees, they're on our work groups, they're chairs of work groups, and so, and they're part of panel discussions. And so their voices are integrated into every strategic decision we make, but we also pay them. So we have an honorarium system. And so we pay them depending on the level of work they do. So if it's a work group, we pay them so much per hour. If they're on a panel discussion, we pay more. We pay them for planning meetings. It's in our budget. It's a line item in our budget, and it's growing exponentially because so many women with lived experience are now part of our work, and they need to be compensated for it. And we also talk to them, do you think this is a fair amount of money? Is this fair to you? And we've had some pushback saying, no, that's not enough. This is what I think is fair in terms of my time, my energy. And also a lot of people are sharing their stories. That's personal. And very many times it brings up trauma.
Yes.
So we have to be careful about that. And we have a fellowship program where we're training women to tell their stories, and we raised money to make sure we had a mental health therapist there to provide mental health support, and because we said we're not going to ask them to do this work without having those kind of supports in place.
And I just want to piggyback on that because I think it makes people feel valued.
Yeah.
That you're not just taking my story and writing a report or sending something into your funding source, or soliciting more funds as a result of my story,
Right.
but you're trying to build a relationship with me, which is very, very important in this process, and you're making me feel valued because there is a lot of trauma in bringing up a lot of these
Yes.
circumstances that
Yeah.
they've gone through. So that's good that
Yeah.
we're thinking that way.
It's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Diane. It's Sheri with The Wardrobe.
Hey.
And
Hi.
I just want to thank you for the work that you are doing, obviously, and that Women's Way has been doing, and recognize how different that is from most of the funding community. We as nonprofit leaders are still asked to, count people by their, trauma. And we're asked by the media to trot clients out as role models for that trauma. And that's something that we have really tried to push back on at the Wardrobe and say, we can share our clients' experiences with you, but they are not there to make, white people and white supremacy feel better that they've done a little bit.
Yes.
Without moving the needle. And so I just wanted to recognize that and ask you, are you in conversation with other funders about how to do this work?
Great question. Yes, we are having conversations. And actually, we started a conversation with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation about this and Philadelphia Foundation because you go to these fundraisers, right? And you have the story of the Black person or the Black child, and they're all like, "Oh, aren't we great?" And then the money goes to the nonprofit, doesn't go back to the community. So, and I've done it. I'm guilty of that. I've done it way too long, and so we are now having conversations, and also with media. Because media does awful things. There's a whole thing called media reparations, by the way, which I think is really interesting. But they've exploited so many people of color for their advantage, right? And I've been called out by it since I've been at Women's Way. So yes, we're starting to have those conversations, and we actually are having conversations with with some journalists about this, because we were approached by, I won't say who, and they said, well, we want to do 2 stories on your fellows, and this is what we want to talk about. I'm like, no. First of all, we've got to ask these women if they want their stories, and they will tell you what they want to share, and they will provide you the language. You know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
It's just like, and you're going to lose some folks, and I know we're going to lose some funders, but these are the discussions we have to have. And I know as an executive director of a nonprofit, we are constrained by what philanthropy tells us what we can and what we can't do, how we measure outcomes. I mean, a lot of things we're now doing is what are meaningful outcomes to those impacted by injustices rather than funders telling us what meaningful outcomes are. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention one of the things that we shared with both our board and our employees in training was the concept of asset framing, which I'm sure most people here are familiar with, but a lot of our general community, especially the media, aren't familiar with it. And then that's putting, the person first before their trauma, essentially. And now I have board and staff members who are calling us out and saying, why are you asking this question? Why are you talking to this person this way or about this person? And so we're holding one another accountable to how we frame the experiences of our clients and use life experience.
That's great. And again, changing our narratives and how we talk about these issues, like at-risk youth, underserved. Why are they under-resourced to begin with? Why are they underserved to begin with? So I love that. And I think changing the narratives and how we talk about that is part of dismantling white supremacy.
Yeah. And one of the comments, and Sheri, I know you guys are doing good work. I've actually donated so many wonderful, every gown goes to you. And I've gone out and talked about what you do with Career Wardrobe to other organizations, so it's great stuff.
Thank you.
It's the concept, though, of you know, I feel good at the end of the day as a white person because, you know, I did my part. I gave my money and now I can go home and sleep well. Well, no. And one of the things we had a really frank conversation about a year ago, you know, why aren't more of our board members going out to the organizations and speaking on behalf of Women's Way? It's more than just raising funds or giving a donation. Get yourself out there. And I know I was one of the few board members because I've worked in social services and I'm in the city and I'm engaging at all different levels that I'm out there as a face of the of Women's Way. But, you know, the average board member on the main line isn't getting out there. They're doing their part and we're grateful for that. But you've got to be the face. You've got to get out there and see these people in their own environment. You've got to be uncomfortable with it in order to learn and to be able to do this. You know, and to go forward and to support you in the work that you're trying to do. That's essential. So we have those kinds of conversations. So that's important to move forward, Sheri.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Diane, I have a question, and thank you both so much. This is such an enriching discussion. I'm so glad Cheryl is here, our wonderful executive director of Women's Resource Center. I'm the president of the board. I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit on the engagement with donors with respect to the white supremacy, and how do you bring that in the conversation? So to your point, you know, they engage with us meaningfully and in a more sustainable manner, which goes deeper than I'm doing my part. I feel good, because I think that's you know, we can't assume that every donor already had done the inner work. And I think we're learning that it's not the case. We are ourselves at the board doing tremendous amount of inner work ourselves, because we're not quite where it's a journey, and we're on the journey. So how do you engage donors in a way that, because you have to balance, right? We desperately need the funds to help women, but at the same time, we want to have this, you know, sustainably, and at the level, you know, that the level that's right, where you do bring this into the conversation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm learning a lot still about that. But I try to build bridges of empathy. And I do that by asking them questions. So I just did this with an individual donor who has a donor advised fund, and I said, how would it feel like if your voice wasn't heard? How would it feel like if someone was making decisions about your life that knew nothing about you? And they're like, oh my God, I would hate that. That's awful. And then so I said, well, you know, we're doing that a lot with philanthropy, right? I said, do you truly know the women that you think you're impacting? Do you know their situation? Do you have a relation? And they're like, no. So it's almost like you have this conversation to build empathy by asking questions. And again, I think it goes back to that self-reflection piece. Instead of saying, you know, what you're doing is white supremacy, you know, that's just going to put up defenses.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's almost like, and then I actually talk about my experience first as a white woman. This is where we can model it. You know what? I came in as the white savior, and I was telling people I thought I knew what they knew because I was actually trying to get them to assimilate to be more like me. And actually I learned I was doing harm. So I start with my own personal journey. And that's where white women can help dismantle white supremacy among other white women. And I've had some really positive results when I start from me. And then trying to ask those questions. And then it just evolves. It's not going to happen in one conversation, believe me. Sometimes it happens after a couple or three, but it takes a while. But it's worth it. And some will never, like, I'm not going there, Diane. Okay, all right. You know, but start with yourself, you know. And I think people love when you're honest and vulnerable, because it then allows them to be more vulnerable.
Yeah, agreed.
But great question, and I'm learning.
Great. So I think we're pretty much wrapping up and out of time. We really appreciate all of you being here with us today and these wonderful questions and being willing to hear what we have to say and hopefully adapt this to your own organizations, or at least start thinking about it and discussing it internally and with your board, et cetera. And I'm just looking forward to everything that we're going to do together with the board and the staff and Women's Way going forward. I think we are off to a great start, and this is good.
Thank you all. And
Yes,
I know all
thank
your
you very
work. You're doing
much.
critical work. Thank you, Myra. You're an amazing board member and friend. And thank you, Philly Cam,
Yeah, thank
for
you
doing
Philly
this
Cam.
show.
This is great
Yeah,
to get the
thank you.
word out there.